Here we go. So last time we talked about camera types and lenses, and the fact, of course, that you need a camera for this class, and hopefully not just your phone camera. So hopefully you'll get something along these lines. Smaller is fine, but a camera that allows you control over the basic functions, and those are called the shutter and the aperture, which we'll be talking about, and ISO. So you don't have to have a big SLR. You certainly don't have to have a high-end one, but you do need a camera over which you have some control. But of course, the most important thing is that you make images. And so by the beginning of next week, I want you to have some images to work on, because we'll start looking at Lightroom. In fact, we'll probably start a little bit today, but next week on Tuesday, we'll start loading images into, I hope, into Lightroom. So you need to have some images to work with. So I will put this up on Canvas in announcements, but I want you to shoot or have at least 20 images to load into Lightroom by the beginning of next week. Okay. Okay. All right. I want to talk about how or what the information that we record in the camera, what it's recorded to. So in the past, and some people, including myself, still use this, we've used film. And modern film is essentially a piece of plastic onto which a light-sensitive silver emulsion is coated. So it was discovered about, wow, we're in 20,000, so about 300 years ago, that certain silver compounds, known as silver halides, respond or darken upon exposure to light. So these compounds are a combination of silver and a member of the halogen group of elements, for any of you who have taken chemistry. So those elements include bromine, iodine, fluorine, chlorine, astatine. So when you combine one of those with silver, you get a light-sensitive compound. So silver iodide, silver bromide, silver chloride. And it was eventually discovered in the early part of the 19th century how to control that reaction and use it to make permanent images with the use of the camera. And we may talk a little bit about the history of the camera, but I won't go into it right now, except to say that. So eventually, processes were devised to control that reaction, to use the silver compounds, those silver halides, to permanently capture information or make images. And modern film still uses those silver compounds. So the silver reacts or responds to light when it's exposed in the camera, and then film is processed in chemicals which make the image visible and also make the image permanent, so that it won't disappear upon further exposure to light or the elements. And usually a negative is made, and from that negative we shine light through that and make positive images onto photographic paper. Digital photography, in digital photography, the camera functions in the same way, but instead of film, we have a sensor, a digital sensor. And so I want to talk about those sensors for a little bit. So let me just get to our class page here in Canvas. Let's see here. Sorry, this is so slow. My apologies. Well, I don't know why that's not coming up. All right, just a moment. It's not coming up either, sorry. Dear, oh dear, okay. Well, this is bad. Huh. All right. Well, let me then talk about a couple of the other functions on the camera. It's very strange. I have a thought. Okay, give me a moment. Well, my apologies for keeping you waiting so long. I'm back. So right now we'll talk about some of the controls in the camera and get back to sensors and so on. But suffice to say that the sensor, which is used in place of film, records the information that enters the camera through the lens. And instead of it being recorded on film, the sensor is made up of tiny little sensors that record information about light and color, and then convert that information into digital form. So they give each little piece of information a numerical value, And then all of that information is organized into what's called a file type. And that file, once it's organized into a file, that file is transferred from the sensor to a memory card. So when you use film, you you have the information recorded onto film and it's then stored there. With digital photography, the information is recorded by the sensor, but it's then transferred to a memory card. And so this is one of two types of memory cards. It's called an SD card. There are also memory cards that are called compact flash cards. Most cameras now use these SD cards. And is that right? Yeah, sorry, it was upside down before. And SD cards, kind of like thumb or flash drives, come in different capacities. Generally, these days in gigabytes. So the first memory card I had, like almost 20 years ago, was like 80 megabytes. And this is a 32 gigabyte card. So there, for every gigabyte, there are 1,000 megabytes. So this card has a huge capacity, and that means it can hold many, many, many images. So I want to talk about file types for a moment, and let me just see if I can bring those up anyway. Let's see here.
If you want, I can share my screen if it's on Canvas.
It's all right. I'll get, thank you
Okay.
very much.
Okay.
Sorry, I had to swap out computers like at the very last minute because my computer has been acting badly. And so this one is a little better anyway. So I want to talk about file types for a moment, and we'll talk about them in greater detail next time. But the most commonly seen file type for images is called the JPEG. And so when you shoot images with your phone or with your camera, again, the information is organized and made into a file. And the most commonly seen image file is the JPEG. So there are two main types of files for images, and they're called lossy and lossless. And that means that when the information is organized into the file, either some information is dumped, so that's a lossy file, or it isn't, which is a lossless file. JPEGs are lossy, and that means that a certain amount of information is dumped. And as it says here, it uses compression to reduce the size of the file. And by compression, it means that a certain amount of information is taken out and gotten rid of to make the file size smaller. And so JPEGs come in different finenesses, you might say, or they dump different amounts of information. And generally, except for on your phones, you can choose how much information is dumped. So there are usually 3 levels of JPEGs: fine, normal, and basic. And fine dumps the least amount of information, normal dumps more, and basic dumps a lot. Lossless files do not dump information. So, in between that, in between those are TIFF files. So they compress a certain amount, but not very much. And so those file types are larger because less information has been gotten rid of. Raw files don't dump any information at all, any data. So they're very big files. However, they don't organize the data either. And so they're not as easily read by many applications. So you may have noticed that when you pull an image onto your computer and you click on it to open it, it automatically opens up in an application. My default application is Preview, and many of you may have Preview. Some people have designated that Apple's Photos application be the default application, or you may have some other application that deals with images. But you have one that opens images automatically on your computer. But raw images cannot be opened automatically because they haven't actually been organized into a file type. So only certain applications like Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom can deal with raw files. If your camera allows you to shoot in RAW, I recommend shooting in RAW because you have so much information there. You can always make a file smaller after the fact, but once information has been dumped, you can never get it back. So we'll talk about this in greater depth, but I do recommend shooting in RAW if your camera allows you to. Most cameras allow you to shoot in both in RAW and in JPEG at the same time, and will make two files of the same image. And you might want to do that to keep the raw files to work on in Lightroom, for example. But if you know you want to post some images to the web or email them to people, the JPEGs are much easier to deal with because they have a file format and because the files are a lot smaller. So you can email them or post them much more easily. Okay. Any questions? Anybody? So we talked about the single lens reflex camera. Okay. Okay. Let me get back here for a moment. So, sorry, every time I change a page, I have to share it again. Can you guys all see that this says ISO and ASA? Okay. So I want to talk about, again, film and the digital sensor, and in this case, how it responds to light, or how quickly. So film, as we said, is made up of silver, and the silver responds to light. And the more silver that's coated on the film, the more quickly the film responds to light, which means that you can use faster shutter speeds, faster exposures, and you don't have to have a person, if you're making a portrait, you don't have to have a person sitting there for 30 seconds without moving to give the film time or the sensor time to expose. So a rating system was devised to tell us how quickly the film or the sensor responds to light and how much light is needed. And that system is called the ISO or the ASA rating system. And with film, it's also known as the film speed. ISO stands for International Standards Organization. ASA stands for American Standards Association, and they're groups that quantify or organize information. So the sensitivity of the film or sensor to light has been quantified, has been given these numerical values. And some of you may have already played around with the ISO ratings on your camera, and some of you may not have. In order to access the ISO ratings, you can either go to the menu in your camera, or often on the back, certainly with SLRs, on the back, you may see a button, as here, I think it is, it says ISO. And if you turn your camera on and hold down the ISO button, then a new window essentially should appear on the LCD at the top of your camera. So this is as it appears. I guess I should turn it up right side up. Right? This is, if you can see it, because it's reflecting. Sorry, this is what it appears like. And then when I hit the ISO button, that all of that information disappears and you just see a number. Right now I think it says 3200. And when I hold that in, I can then use one of these rotating rings on the back of the camera to change the ISO number. And the lower the number, the less sensitive the sensor is to light. And as I increase the number, the sensitivity to light increases. So my camera starts at an ISO of 100. Some go down to 50. Many start at 200. Mine goes up to 6400. Many of your cameras will go higher than that, to 12,800 or 25,200 and so on. So if you look at the numbers that I've written out here, you can see that the numbers double as we go down or as they go up. And that refers specifically to the sensitivity of the sensor to light, how quickly it responds to light. And so I've put an arrow here from 100 to 200. And so if you change your rating, your ISO rating, from 100 to 200, the sensitivity to light doubles. That means that the sensor will respond twice as quickly. It's twice as sensitive to light. There's a direct relationship between the sensitivity to light and then how much light is required to make an exposure. So if you double I should say in general terms, if you increase the sensitivity to light, you will decrease how much light is required to make an exposure, how much light you have to let into the camera to make a proper exposure. And by that, I mean one that's neither too light nor too dark, but represents tones accurately. So my hair, dark hair, lighter skin, purplish glasses, and so on. So when I change the ISO rating from 100 to 200, I double the sensitivity to light, and I therefore decrease how much light is required. And the relationship between sensitivity and light requirement is inversely proportional. And so if I double the sensitivity, my light requirement is cut in half. So if I set the ASA or ISO to be twice as sensitive to light, I require half as much light as I did in order to make that same proper exposure. And that holds true as we go down the line of ISO or ASA ratings. And it doesn't matter where you start. You could start at 800 and change to 1600. 1600 is twice 800. It's therefore twice as sensitive to light as 800. And it therefore requires half as much light as 800 to make that same proper exposure. If we go in the opposite direction, if we change from a more sensitive to a less sensitive rating, in this case from 6400 to 3200, we are decreasing the sensitivity, and that means that we'll require more light. So the less sensitive the rating, the more light is required. The more sensitive the rating, the less light is required. So if I change from 6400 to 3200, 3200 is half 6400. It's therefore half as sensitive to light as 6400, and it requires twice as much light as 6400 to make that same proper exposure. And again, you can start anywhere, and that relationship holds true. So where do we use these? So outside on a bright sunny day, here in Santa Cruz it's cloudy, but anyway, generally outside on a bright sunny day, you have a lot of light. And even on a bright cloudy day, you have a lot of light. And so you don't need to use a setting that is very sensitive, that doesn't require as much light. You have a lot of light. And so you would use a lower sensitivity rating, maybe 100 or 200 outside on a bright sunny day. So again, these lower ratings require a lot of light. And on a bright sunny day, or in some situation where it's bright, you have a lot of light. Conversely, let's say you're shooting in a club or a bar where you have much less light, and it might be inadvisable for you to use a flash, for example. People might become unhappy with you if you did that. So in a situation where you have less light, you would want to use a more sensitive ISO rating that doesn't require as much light. Because it's more sensitive to light, you don't have to have as much in order to make that same proper exposure. So again, in lower light situations, you would use a more sensitive ISO rating. And in situations where you have a lot of light, you would use a less sensitive rating. Two other things. So with film, if you happen to be using film, film comes set with a specific sensitivity or ISO rating. So if you've used color film, you might have seen Kodacolor 200 or Ektachrome 400. That number after the name is telling you what the ISO rating is, how sensitive it is to light. So there was an old slide film called Kodachrome, and it said Kodachrome 64. And that meant that the ISO rating for that film was 64. So film has a specific rating, and it can't be changed because the amount of silver that's embedded in the film is fixed. And so with many cameras, you can change the ISO rating, as I did with the digital camera. But if it's a film camera, I can change the rating on the camera, but the rating, the actual silver content won't change. So you don't want to do that. But with digital cameras that have sensors, when you change the ISO rating, you actually change the sensitivity. And you do that not by changing how much silver there is, because it's not used in digital photography, but you change the amount of electricity or power that runs through the sensor. And that will change the sensitivity. Um, there is a change in the quality of the image as well. So with film, the more silver there is, and the higher the sensitivity, the more grainy the image appears. And you've probably seen images that seem to be made up of blobs, you know, millions or thousands of blobs of either of different colors or of black and white and gray if the image is in black and white. And what you're seeing are the individual grains of silver that have been blown up. And the higher the ISO rating and the more silver there is, the grainier the image appears. The less silver there is, the smoother the image appears without grain. The digital equivalent of grain is called noise. And noise also appears as blobs in the image, a grainy effect, and also something that is called an artifact, or things that are called artifacts. And those are like usually blobs of color that don't belong there. And as the ISO rating goes up, you tend to see more and more of these blobs of orange and green and purple that don't belong in the image. Some photographers love grain and they love noise. They like that kind of gritty feeling that the image has, and they purposely shoot with high-speed film or higher ISO ratings in order to get that effect. Most people don't like it. They like, excuse me, smoother images that don't have all these blobs and so on. And so the general rule is that you want to shoot at the lowest ISO rating that is feasible or acceptable in the lighting situation in which you're photographing. So if it's really bright out, you do want to use a lower ISO rating. If it's dark or darker, then you'll start to increase the ISO rating. But if you're outside on a bright sunny day, you don't want to use generally like a 3200 rating. And aside from the graininess and or noisiness that you'll get, there are practical reasons, which we'll talk about in greater detail, but you will be limited in the shutter speeds and apertures that you can make use of if you use an ISO rating in a situation for which it's not really designed. So if you use a high speed or very sensitive rating when you have lots of light, or if you use a low speed, a slow ISO, or a less sensitive one in a situation where you do not have a lot of light, then you'll be much more limited in the shutter speeds and apertures that you can make use of. Okay. So ISO is a tool that we use to allow us to photograph in different lighting situations. And by that, in this case, I mean how much light there is. It allows us to photograph in these different lighting situations without perhaps having to use a tripod or without having to use flash. So it's something that you will fool around with, I hope, and our first assignment will deal in part with ISO. So we'll practice with it, and we'll experiment, you might say. Any questions on ISO? All good? Okay. So I want you to, of course, play around with your cameras, but go ahead and check out the ISO ratings, see what happens to your images when you do so. Okay. All right, let me go back for a moment. And, oops, silly Cedar. Come on. There we go. Okay, and next I want to talk about the light meter. And the light meter is a mechanism that's built into your camera that tells you or tells the camera how much light you should let in or it should let in to make a proper exposure. So the light meter has a little sensor called a solenoid that reads how much available light there is. And based on that information and the ISO rating, because that also controls how much light is required, based on those two pieces of information, the light meter tells you or indicates to you in some way how much light is required. So light meters have a display in your camera. And generally you'll see it in the viewfinder, in the little window back here. And you'll also see it if you activate your display on the back. And you may or may not see it here on the smaller LCD on top of the camera. And light meters come in different types. So if you go into your controls, you may see that you have different choices for the light meter. The very basic light meter, the very first ones just kind of averaged the overall amount of light there was and told your camera that. Then came what are called center weighted light meters that give more weight or credence to the information in the center of the frame rather than what, you know, the information on the edges. And then they became more detailed, giving weight, you know, to the center, and then some more to the outer, you know, around the center, and then it divided the frame into quadrants and so on. And then finally, matrix or evaluative light meters were devised, and they're very complex, and they look at the entire frame and they evaluate what's there. Some of them have face identification and can tell when they're heads and so on. This is where you want your light meter set. And generally that's the default. But if you go into the metering menu, you might want to make sure that it is in fact set to matrix or evaluative. There's another type of light meter called a spot meter, and that is another setting that DSLRs have. And that will take a meter reading from a specific area in your scene rather than the entire scene. So let's say there's one spot all the way back here that you want to make sure is exposed correctly, and you don't necessarily care about the rest of the frame. You can set the meter to spot meter and just take a meter reading from that. And it can be useful for that sort of thing. However, you don't want to keep your meter set at spot because it's designed just to meter for a specific area, and may give your camera incorrect information about the overall exposure. So you do want to make sure your light meter is set to matrix or evaluative. And then the light meter will in some way display to you whether or not you're exposing correctly. So it uses as a starting point wherever your camera happens to be set. And we'll talk about those settings, the shutter speeds and the apertures next. But I want to talk about the light meter first. But it uses as a starting point where whatever aperture the lens is set to and whatever shutter speed the camera is set to, and then it will indicate to you whether or not that is the correct amount of light. And it may do that in a very simple way with a little dot in the middle that illuminates if you're correct, and a minus sign if there's not enough light, and a plus sign if there's too much. It may be more specific. It may tell you how much you're under or overexposing by in what are called stops. So -1, -2, +1, +2. It may just have a hatch mark. This is very common. A center hatch mark that tells you that you're exposing correctly, and then incrementally with hatch marks, how much you're under or overexposing by. But in some way, the light meter will indicate to you whether or not you are exposing correctly. And you may or may not have to fix it yourself. So if you're shooting in the manual mode, and we'll go over the modes in a while, if you're shooting in the manual mode, the light meter will indicate to you whether or not you're exposing correctly, but it won't fix it for you. On the other end, if you're shooting in the auto mode, where the camera does everything for you, you might not even see the light meter because you have no control over it in the auto mode. The camera is doing everything for you. But we'll talk about those things in a while. Okay. So any questions on the ISO ratings, film speed, or on light meters? All good? So the light meter is something you really need to pay attention to. Especially, again, if you're shooting with the camera set in the manual mode. And I don't want you to be shooting in the auto mode. So we'll talk about the different modes, but I want you to shoot in a mode where you have some control over the camera, and you have essentially no control over the camera in the auto mode. Okay. Let us talk about the specific mechanisms that we use to control the amount of light entering the camera. So there are two of them. One is built into the body of the camera, and one is built into the lens. And that is true for 35mm small format cameras. With some medium and large format cameras, both are built into the lens. But we won't worry about that for now. So the first mechanism I want to talk about is called the shutter. And for us, the shutter is built into the body of the camera. And we looked at it last time a little bit. And it's this window right back in here. There, now you can kind of see it. This window that's 24 by 36 millimeters. And this window controls how long light is allowed into the camera. And so it's called the shutter, and the settings are called shutter speeds, because each setting has a different, or allows the shutter to remain open for different lengths of time, which are described in seconds and in fractions of seconds. So let me just bring up our next page there. All right, so can you see this where it says shutter? Okay, so the shutter controls the length of time that light is allowed into the camera, and the shutter settings are called shutter speeds, and they're described in seconds and in fractions of seconds. And so here are shutter speeds, and these are what are called the whole stop numbers or settings. And so, many of your cameras will have numbers that are in between these numbers. Some of them in half stop increments, others in a third of a stop. But all cameras have these numbers. And so these are the numbers I want you to learn for this class and in general. So the first number is generally number 1, and that is 1 second. Some cameras will have preset shutter speeds that are longer than 1 second. And as with the ISO numbers, they double. So 1 second, 2, 4, 8, and then it kind of jumps a little to 15 seconds and then 30 seconds. And 30 seconds is usually the longest preset speed that you'll find on a camera. And some cameras, as I said, do not have these longer presets, but all SLRs have what's called a bulb setting. So if you look at your shutter speeds, there'll be the letter B, which stands for bulb. And in this setting, you can lock the shutter open for as long as you want. And it can be a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes or hours. That's up to you. So let me set this to the bulb setting. And when you do that, remember this reflex mirror that you can kind of see pops up out of the way. And then the shutter, the shutter opens. And again, if you're in the bulb setting, it will remain open for as long as you want it to, And that, that can be a great length of time, and you may not want to stand there for an hour with your finger on the shutter release button. So photographers use something called a cable release, and they're physical cable releases that screw into the end of the shutter release button. And with electronic cameras, there are electronic shutter releases or cable releases that, I don't know if this even has a mechanical one. I think not. So they're electronic cable releases that are essentially remote controls that allow you to lock the shutter open and then to close it. And the more complex ones allow you to set specific times. So you can set it for 15 minutes and then go off and take a little snooze or whatever. And the remote control essentially will deal with the rest for you. So in that way, you can make long exposures, and we'll talk about why you might want to do that, without having to just stand there with your finger on the shutter release button. Then back to this here, after a second, the shutter speeds go down into the fractions of seconds. So they get shorter and shorter and shorter. And most of your cameras will not show the shutter speeds as fractions. You'll just see the lower number, the denominator. So it looks as if they're getting larger and larger, but in fact, they're fractions, 1 over the numbers. So they get smaller and smaller, shorter and shorter. So I want to talk about the relationship between and among the shutter speeds. In a general sense, when you change the shutter speed from a slower to a faster shutter speed, you decrease the length of time that the shutter remains open, and you therefore decrease the amount of light entering the camera. So if I change the shutter speed from 1 second to half a second, you can see right there, I've cut the length of time that the shutter remains open in half. And when I do that, I also cut the amount of light entering the camera in half. And that holds true for every shutter speed. So let me just go over the shutter speeds briefly, from 1 second to half a second, a quarter of a second, an eighth of a second, a 15th of a second. So there's a little jump there. You would expect it to be a 16th of a second, but it isn't. Then a 30th of a second, a 60th of a second, then another little jump to 1/125th of a second instead of the logical 1/120th, and then 1/250th, 1/500th, 1/1000th of a second. Some cameras go further than that to 1/2000th of a second. So this film camera has a maximum shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second. And some cameras go further. So this camera goes to 1/8000th of a second. So after 1/2000th, you'd have 1/4000th of a second and 1/8000th of a second, which is really, really fast. And there are very few cameras that have shutter speeds that are faster than about an 8,000th or maybe a 10,000th of a second, because faster than that, the shutters can't be accurate. They can't physically move faster than that, or at least not accurately. And so after that, different things are done. But for us, for our purposes in general photography, we don't need such fast shutter speeds. I mean, faster than an 8,000th of a second. So for specialty work, some of which we'll look at a little later on, you'll see faster, and there are ways to stop motion faster than that. So I want to show you what those shutter speeds look like, just not every single one, but a few of them. So this is 1 second. Seems longer than that, doesn't it? But 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. We were taught to use the word Mississippi for seconds. I don't know what's taught now. But that's 1 second, and so I won't do every stop, but this is 1/4 of a second. And you can both see and hear that it's faster. And what you're hearing is not the shutter, but the reflex mirror popping up out of the way. The shutter itself is very quiet. So that's 1/15th of a second, 1/60th of a second. And now it's harder to see that the shutter is actually moving. Get a reflection here. 1/250th of a second. One 1,000th of a second. And so you can hardly see that it's moved. And here, this is the fastest shutter speed this camera is capable of, 2,000th of a second. And really, you can hardly see that it's moved at all. It's so fast. So again, the faster the shutter speed, the less light is allowed in. And so often you will use fast shutter speeds in order to, well, in situations where you have a lot of light, and also to stop or freeze motion. And we'll talk about how we do that after we've talked about both of these mechanisms. But I want to talk about what happens when you change the shutter speeds. So first of all, when you change the shutter speed from a slower to a faster speed or setting, you decrease the amount of light entering the camera by 1/2 per stop. So wherever you start here in this line of shutter speeds, when you change from a slower to a faster shutter speed, you decrease the amount of light entering the camera by 1/2 per stop. So let's say we start at 1/30th of a second and change to a 1/60th of a second. A 1/60th of a second is half as long as a 1/30th, and it therefore lets in half as much light. If we then change from a 1/60th of a second to 1/125th of a second, even though logically it should be 1/120th, we again cut the amount of light in half. So now we've done something called stopping down. We've stopped down by 2 stops. We started at a 1/30th of a second, went to a 1/60th, and then to 1/125th. So that's 2 stops. So we cut the amount of light in half, and we cut it in half again. And so overall, what we've done to the amount of light is to decrease it to 1/4 of what it had been. How do I figure that out? Half of a half is 1/4. And I can determine that by multiplying the denominators. So when the numerators, the upper numbers, are the same, all you have to do is multiply the lower numbers, the denominators. So a half times a half is 1/4. And so 1/125th of a second lets in 1/4 as much light as a 30th of a second. If I then stop down to 1/250th of a second, I've stopped down by 3 stops, 60th, 1/125th, and then a 2/50th. So I cut the amount of light in half, I cut it in half again, and I cut it in half again. And half of a quarter is an eighth. Or a half times a half is a quarter, times a half is an eighth. And so 1/250th of a second lets in 1/8 as much light as a 30th of a second. If I stop down to a 500th, I've now stopped down by 4 stops. 1, 2, 3, 4. And a half times a half is a 1/4, times a half is an 1/8, times a half is a 1/16. And so 1/500th of a second lets in 1/16 as much light as a 30th of a second. So each time I'm cutting the amount of light in half. Seen a different way, if this circle represents the total amount of light entering the camera at my starting point, and in this case it's a 30th of a second, but it can be wherever you start. When we stop down by 1 stop, we cut the amount of light in half. So when I go from a 30th of a second to a 60th of a second, I've cut this circle in half and I'm left with a half. If I then stop down to 1/125th of a second, I cut that half in half and I'm left with 1/4. When I stop down from 1/125th of a second to 1/250th of a second, I cut the quarter in half and I'm left with an 1/8. When I, stop down from a 2/50th of a second to 1/500th of a second, I cut the 1/8 in half and I'm left with 1/16. If I change from a 500th of a second to 1/1000th of a second, I cut the 16th in half and I'm left with 1/32nd, and then 1/64th, 1/128th, and so on. So each time I cut that half in half, and so I let in less and less light. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions? All good? Okay, so the shutter is the first of 2 mechanisms that we use to control the amount of light entering the camera. And the second is called the aperture. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I forgot to tell you what happens when you go in the opposite direction. So we just talked about decreasing the amount of light, but when you change the shutter speed from a faster to a slower shutter speed, you increase the length of time the shutter remains open and therefore the amount of light entering the camera. So when you change the shutter speed from a faster to a slower shutter speed or setting, you increase the amount of light entering the camera by 2 times per stop. So if, for example, 1/4000th of a second is half as long as 1/2000th of a second, then 1/2000th of a second is twice as long as 1/4000th of a second. And if it is twice as long, it lets in twice as much light. And that also holds true per stop or per setting, and it doesn't matter where you begin. that rule holds true. So if you start at 1/250th of a second and open up by one stop and go to 1/125th of a second, you double the amount of light entering the camera. And from 1/125th of a second to 1/60th of a second, you again double the amount of light entering the camera. And from 1/60th of a second to 1/30th of a second, you double the amount of light. So if I open up from 1/250th of a second to 1/60th of a second, I've opened up by 2 stops with 1/125th in the middle. So I doubled the amount of light and I doubled it again. And again, I multiply these numbers. 2 times 2 is 4. Therefore, 1/60th of a second lets in 4 times as much light as 1/250th of a second. And if I then open up to a 30th of a second, I again double the amount of light entering the camera. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8. So a 30th of a second lets in 8 times as much light as 1/250th of a second. If I open up to a 15th of a second, I've now opened up by 4 stops. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. So a 15th of a second lets in 16 times as much light as a 2/50th of a second. And if I open up to an 1/8 of a second, 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16, times 2 is 32, and then 64, and 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, it doubles each time. So obviously in this case, I would be going into the whole second settings, but regardless of where you start, that rule holds true. When you change the shutter speed from a faster to a slower speed or setting, you increase the amount of light entering the camera by 2 times per stop. Okay. Any questions? And now, this second, I don't know what happened to that. Ooh, boy, did that get messed up. Yikes. Okay, well, this is supposed to say, wow, is that bad? I'll have to rescan that. The aperture is located in the lens, and it's an adjustable diaphragm, so it opens and closes. There, you can kind of see it, I think. So it opens and closes, and in that way controls how much light enters the camera. So obviously when it's wide open, a lot of light enters the camera. And as let me get that reflection back, as I stop it down, less and less light enters the camera. Okay, so again, the aperture is the adjustable diaphragm located in the lens that controls, you could say, the intensity or the amount of light entering the camera. So the larger the opening, the more light enters. The smaller the opening, the less light enters. These settings, the aperture settings, are called f-stops. F stands for focal, but they're never called focal stops. They're always called f-stops. For some reason, the F is always written lowercase. I don't know why, but F and then either a forward slash or period and then a number following the F. And the rule, of course, is the smaller the F's, well, I shouldn't say. The larger the aperture, and the aperture is determined by the diameter of the aperture, and the diameter is the distance across a circle when that line passes through the center. But the f-stop numbers are kind of the reverse of the size of the aperture. So the smaller the f-stop number, for example, f2, the larger the diameter of the aperture, and the larger the f-stop number, the smaller the diameter of the aperture. So that's kind of how they are. Obviously, I haven't drawn them to scale very well. But again, the smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture. And as the f-stop numbers increase, the size or the diameter of the aperture decreases. The maximum aperture that a lens is capable of varies from lens to lens. So I started here at f2. This lens actually opens up a little beyond f2, but let's say it has a maximum aperture of f2. Your lens probably does not have that same maximum aperture. So zoom lenses, which we talked about on Tuesday, zoom lenses which have more than one or many focal lengths built into one lens, these lenses generally have a maximum aperture that is somewhat smaller than comparable fixed focal length lenses. So many of your zoom lenses, those of you who have zoom lenses, have a maximum aperture of f3.5. And if you look at the outer ring of your lens, you'll see that it says somewhere on it, mine says 1 colon, first it gives the focal lengths, 18 to 140, so it's an 18 to 140 lens. And then over here, it says 1 colon 3.5 to 5.6. And those are the maximum apertures the lens is capable of, 3.5 being the largest. And you can see up here that 3.5 is kind of midway between 2.8 and 4. So like the shutter speeds, the f-stop numbers or the aperture numbers have intermediate settings, but these are the whole stop numbers that I want you to use. So some lenses have half stop settings, halfway between each number, and others have 1/3 stop increments. But they all have these numbers. Again, maybe not starting at f2 and maybe not ending at f22, maybe going further, but within those parameters, they have the same numbers. So f2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, f8, f11, f16, f22. If you look at these numbers, you can see that every other number doubles. So 2, 4, 8, 16, the next logical number would be f32, which my zoom lens has, but this little lens does not. And then the next logical one after that would be 64. In between those, 2.8, 5.6, the next one should be 11.2, but they rounded it off. So to 11, 22, and then the next setting would be 44. So again, every other number doubles. But they are, I think, a little harder to remember than the shutter speeds, which are much more logically, you can see the relationship more logically as they are cut in half or double. The maximum aperture that your lens is capable of is important for two reasons. First of all, it is useful to have a lens that opens up further. And so the maximum aperture that your lens is capable of is a good way of getting a sense of how good the lens is. And lenses that open up to larger apertures cost more money. And the larger the maximum aperture, say from f5.6 to 4 to 2.8 to 2, the more the lens will cost. It's relatively easy to make a lens sharp in the center of the glass. Even cheapo plastic lenses can be pretty sharp in the center. It's much more difficult to get them to be accurate as you go out and out in the glass, the elements of glass that make up the lens. It requires a lot more precision in the grinding of it, in the shaping of those elements of glass to make the lens accurate out to the edges so that you don't get distortion. That is bending of the light where people look as if they're stretched out. Also accurate color transmission. And so that's why they cost more. The second thing, I guess, about the maximum aperture is that it is the second term, I guess, or name that is used for your lens. So the first one is the focal length of the lens, as we discussed last time. So if somebody asks me what lens I have on this camera, I'll say, I have a 50 millimeter lens. But I'll also tell the person the maximum aperture. I'll say, I have a 50 millimeter f2 lens. The maximum aperture is also called the speed of the lens because it indicates a little bit, not quite directly, but it indicates the maximum shutter speed that you can use with the lens. And so the larger the maximum aperture, the faster the lens is. So a lens that has a large maximum aperture is called a fast lens. And a lens that has a smaller maximum aperture is called a slower lens. And so somebody might ask me what the speed of my lens is. And somebody might say, hey, Sita, how fast is your lens? And then I will tell that person the maximum aperture. I'll say, oh, it's an f2 lens, or it's an f4, or whatever. So how fast is your lens, or what's the speed of your lens, refers to the maximum aperture that your lens is capable of. But again, you use those two terms together, the focal length and the maximum aperture. So this is a 50 millimeter f2 lens. This is an 18 to 140 3.5 dash 5.6 lens. So if you can see that over here, let me turn it. It says 3.5 dash 5.6. And that is because when I change the focal length of the lens, how long it is, the maximum aperture also changes. It's kind of funny. But if I set my aperture to 3.5, which is the largest aperture this lens is capable of, and I have my focal length set to the shortest portion, that's 18 millimeters for this lens, as I extend the lens out, I can see on my LCD that the aperture changes. So at 18 millimeters, it's at f3.5, but when I extend it out to 35 millimeters, which is the shortest of the normal lenses, then now it's f4.2. At 70 millimeters, it's f5. And at 140 millimeters, it's now f5.6. So when I extend the lens out, I lose maximum aperture. So again, at 18, it's here at f3.5, but when I'm out at 140 millimeters into the telephoto portion of the lens, now my maximum aperture is f5.6, which is 1.5 stops less. Okay. So here's what we just talked about. And this is, all of these notes that I'm showing you are available to you. They're in the modules. So up here, all the way back up here, in Canvas, you have these things you can click on, and modules is where you'll find all of this information. There are different modules for the camera, for lenses, and so on. And this is under aperture and shutter speeds, or shutter speeds and apertures. So let me get back down here. So the relationships between and among the f-stops is comparable, or are comparable, should be are, I think, to those between and among the shutter speeds, in that when you change the f-stop from a larger to a smaller aperture, you decrease the amount of light entering the camera by 1/2 per stop. And when you change the f-stop from a smaller to a larger aperture, you increase the amount of light entering the camera by 2 times per stop. So again, as with the shutter speeds, each time you stop down, which is decreasing the amount of light, you decrease the amount of light entering the camera by 1/2 per stop. And when you change the aperture from a smaller to a larger aperture, you double the amount of light entering the camera per stop. Even though the numbers are not quite as obvious, or those relationships are not quite as obvious as with the shutter speeds. Okay. Any questions on these? No? Okay, well, you're probably saying, okay, well, we have the aperture and the shutter speed, now what? Well, it's 2 o'clock, so it's about time for us to stop. Next time we'll put the numbers together and look at the camera and how we use the aperture and the shutter together to control the amount of light entering the camera, and why we might choose changing the shutter over choosing the aperture, or vice versa. Okay, so I would like you to take a look at the readings, and let me get back to the modules here. So here under modules, there's our welcome. There's also more than that, and I'll show that to you in a moment. The basics of the camera, the lens, lenses, and what we just went over, controlling the light entering the camera, the aperture, and the shutter. So I'd like you to do the readings on the shutter and the aperture, and then these notes that I just showed you are there for you. Let me just go back over here. Okay, so after the welcome, my wonderful little welcome speech, sorry, that just changed. Canvas resources. So if you have questions about Canvas, you can click on that. Zoom invitations. Where's our class one? Sorry. Anyway, there are 2 Zoom invitations, one for the classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and another for our for my office hours, actually. Let me just get into that. Sorry. Oh, come on. What do you mean it can't connect to server? Of course it can. All right. Just a moment here. It's crazy. There we go. All right, sorry. All right, so Zoom meetings, invitations for the class and for office hours. And then again, the basics, the camera, terms and definitions, my notes that we've gone over, the lens, the same thing, lens readings for the different types of lenses. And then at the end of each module, those written notes will be available to you. And what we went over today, controlling the light entering the camera, the aperture and the shutter, these readings, and then class notes. And then the next topic will be what's called equivalent exposures. And that is putting those numbers together. Okay. So, it's paused. It's not supposed to be paused. Sorry. Sorry, can you see these now? My apologies. So this is on Canvas in modules, the different modules available to you. The first one says Lightroom. So in here you will find instructional videos, which we'll go over, and I mentioned those last time. Also, what we'll go over on Tuesday, creating your own personal Lightroom catalog. So again, I want you to have images to work on by the beginning of next week. And let me get out of that. So I'd like you to have images to work on by the beginning of next week. And we will go over the basics, the first part of the basics of Lightroom so that we can start working in Lightroom as quickly as possible. So again, I want you to have some images to load. I will get you information on getting access to Lightroom if you don't already have it. So I will give the dean all of your names, and in some way you will be contacted so that you can have access to Adobe Lightroom. Okay. For the first part of working on or in Lightroom, if you don't have new images, it doesn't really matter in terms of loading them into Lightroom. I, of course, want you to be shooting constantly, but if you have older images that you want to load into Lightroom and work on for this, that's fine. Okay, obviously, I don't want old images for new assignments. You know, there are a couple of exceptions. We have one student who is in isolation in China, so he can't go out and shoot, you know. But hopefully we can at least go out a little or look around our newly confined existences and find new things to photograph. Okay. But again, for the first part, if they're older images, that's fine. We just want to load images into Lightroom and get started working. Okay. Any questions? Anybody? Anybody? No? Well, okay, we have a holiday weekend coming up, such as it is. I hope you all have an enjoyable weekend. Yeah, stay safe, stay healthy, stay safe, make images, have fun. Okay. Email me if you have any questions, and otherwise I will see you on Tuesday. Okay. Take care. Bye.